Everyone laughed when a poor father bought an old abandoned ranch. No one believed anything good could ever come from those ruins. But one day, while clearing out the old barn, he discovered something that would change his and his daughter's lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The morning began the same way every morning did for Thomas, with the rattle of the old heater, the hum of a passing freight truck, and the quiet breathing of his daughter asleep on the other side of their small trailer. The air inside was cold and smelled faintly of metal and damp clothes. He sat at the table, drinking coffee so weak it was almost clear, staring at the stack of unpaid bills that never seemed to shrink. Outside, the sky was pale and washed out, the kind of sky that promised another day of hard work and little reward. He rubbed his face with both hands and whispered to himself that he could get through one more day. He had been saying the same thing for years. His daughter Lily stirred under the thin blanket, mumbling something in her sleep. When she opened her eyes, she smiled at him, the same smile her mother used to give when the world was falling apart. It had been 3 years since cancer took Anna, and the silence she left behind had never really gone away. Lily had inherited her mother's eyes, bright and searching, and her stubborn faith that things would somehow get better. Thomas tried to keep that hope alive for her sake, but the weight of life pressed harder with each passing month. He worked long hours at the construction site outside town, carrying bricks, mixing cement, sometimes climbing scaffolding until his arms trembled. The pay barely covered food, gas, and the rent for the rusted trailer they called home. Every evening he came back exhausted, his hands raw, his back aching, but Lily would run to him anyway, wrapping her small arms around his waist and asking about his day as if he were some kind of hero. That look in her eyes made the pain bearable. Still, there were nights when he sat outside under the buzzing street lamp, wondering how much longer he could hold everything together. It was on one of those evenings after another long shift that he first saw the notice. The courthouse hallway smelled of bleach and old paper. He was there to pay a late fee on his truck registration when a faded piece of paper on the bulletin board caught his eye. The edges were curling, the ink slightly smeared, but one line stood out. County property auction. Abandoned ranch, sold as is. He almost walked past it. Places like that were for rich investors or dreamers with money to waste. But something in him stopped. Maybe it was the word ranch, or maybe it was the idea of land, a piece of earth no one could take away. He tore off one of the small slips at the bottom with the auction details and folded it into his pocket without thinking. That night he told Lily about it. She sat cross-legged on the floor, coloring a picture of a big red barn under a wide sky. "Could we have a place like that?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Maybe one day." She looked up. "You always say that, Daddy." Her voice was soft but not accusing. It just stated a fact, that dreams in their world were always postponed, never realized. He didn't answer, just ruffled her hair and told her to get some sleep. But long after she drifted off, he sat at the table, turning that paper over and over in his hands. The auction was the following week. He knew he shouldn't even think about it. They barely had enough for groceries, and his truck was one breakdown away from being useless. But something about the idea of a ranch, even a broken one, pulled at him. Maybe it was because he was tired of being a tenant, tired of moving every time rent went up, tired of living in someone else's shadow. He wanted roots, not for himself, but for Lily, a place where she could grow up seeing open fields instead of parking lots. At the auction, there were only 3 people in the small county room: an elderly clerk, a man in a suit representing some bank, and Thomas. When the clerk read the description aloud, Lot 47B, McKinley Ranch, 15 acres, house and barn, sold as is. The banker shook his head and left. The clerk looked at Thomas as if waiting for him to change his mind. "Minimum bid, $700, she said. Thomas swallowed hard. That was almost everything he had saved. But when she asked if there were any offers, his voice surprised him. 720. No one else spoke. The gavel came down, sharp and final. "Sold to Mr. Thomas Miller." The words echoed strangely in the empty room. Walking out of the courthouse, he felt lightheaded, almost dizzy. The papers in his hands looked unreal, too thin to represent something so huge. He had just bought land, an actual piece of land. But as he stepped outside into the gray afternoon, the weight of it settled over him. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was real, and it would demand everything he had left. He thought of Lily and of the years ahead, both terrifying and promising, and for the first time in months, a spark of something like hope flickered in his chest. When he told the guys at work, they laughed. "You bought that place?" one of them said. "Man, that thing's been rotting out there for decades. The roof's caved in, the well's dry, and they say the last owner died trying to fix it." Another added, "You'd get more out of $700 at a junkyard." Thomas let them laugh. He didn't try to defend himself. He'd learned long ago that explaining a dream to someone who'd never risked anything was a waste of breath. The following weekend, he loaded what little they owned into his old pickup, a couple of boxes, a mattress, and a small chest of tools, and drove toward the edge of the county. The road turned from asphalt to dirt, winding through fields gone wild with weeds. When the ranch finally came into view, he slowed the truck to a crawl. It stood at the base of a low hill, half hidden by tall grass and thorny bushes. The house leaned slightly to one side, windows clouded with dust, and the porch sagged like a tired old man. Beyond it, the barn rose gray and hollow, its doors hanging crooked. He killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled of sun-baked soil and dry wood. Crickets droned in the grass, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried. Lily climbed out of the truck, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and looked around with wide eyes. "It's big," she said softly. "And quiet." Her voice carried a kind of wonder he hadn't heard in her before. "Can we really live here?" Thomas looked at her and nodded. "If we work hard enough." They spent the first evening exploring the property. The yard was overgrown, fences had fallen, and the water pump was rusted solid. Inside the house, dust coated everything. The living room floor sagged, and mice had chewed through what was left of the wallpaper. But there was a fireplace still standing, and when Thomas struck a match and lit a small fire, the glow filled the room with warmth that felt almost human. Lily curled up beside him, smiling through the smoke. Later that night, as they sat outside eating bread and canned beans, the wind swept through the grass, carrying the scent of rain. The horizon glowed faintly with lightning far away. "It's beautiful here," Lily whispered, "even if it's broken." Thomas nodded. "Everything starts broken. The trick is not giving up before it's fixed." When the first drops of rain began to fall, they ran inside, laughing, and closed the warped door behind them. The sound of rain on the roof was heavy, uneven, and yet strangely comforting. Lying on the floor beside his daughter, Thomas stared at the flickering firelight and thought about the journey ahead, the repairs, the hard work, the uncertainty. But for the first time in years, he felt that the future, though uncertain, belonged to him. Outside, the barn stood silent in the darkness, its black silhouette etched against the sky. Lightning flashed once, illuminating the faded sign still nailed above the door. McKinley Ranch, 1912. Thomas noticed it through the window, the letters barely visible, and something in him stirred, a feeling he couldn't name yet. He turned back toward the fire and closed his eyes, letting the rain drown out the rest of the world. He didn't know it yet, but the decision he made that day, the choice to buy a forgotten ranch that everyone else had written off, would change everything. It would unearth secrets buried for generations, pull him into a story that began long before he was born, and test how far a father could go to give his child a better life. For now, though, it was only a beginning, the quiet before the years of struggle, the fragile moment when a dream was still only a promise whispered between the cracks of ruin and hope. The next morning, the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The rain from the night before had left the ground soft and glistening, puddles catching the sunlight that crept slowly over the hills. Thomas woke to the sound of roosters somewhere in the distance and the steady creak of the wind through the broken boards of the porch. For a long moment he simply lay still, listening. The quiet here was unlike anything he had ever known in the city. Deep, patient, almost sacred. Then the stillness was broken by the small voice of his daughter. "Daddy, I think the roof is leaking again." He opened his eyes and saw her crouched near the corner of the room, holding a metal bowl under a dripping hole in the ceiling. She grinned when she noticed him awake. "We're catching rain," she said proudly, as though it were a game. He smiled, stretched, and rose from the thin blanket. "Good work, sweetheart. Guess that's our first project." The fire from last night had long gone out, leaving behind cold ashes. He rekindled it, boiled some water, and poured it into 2 chipped cups. The coffee was weak, and Lily's was only hot water with a spoonful of sugar, but she drank it like it was a feast. By mid-morning, the sun was already harsh, burning away the dampness. Thomas stepped outside, surveying the land in daylight for the first time. What had seemed mysterious in the dark now looked overwhelming. The yard was a jungle of weeds and thorns. A section of the fence had completely collapsed. The barn loomed in the distance, larger than he remembered, its roof missing panels that let sunlight slash through the gloom inside. The house itself leaned slightly forward as if bowing under years of neglect. He rubbed his neck and exhaled. "One thing at a time," he said quietly. He spent the first days clearing debris and patching what he could. The work was slow and endless. Every nail he drove into the wood seemed to summon 3 more problems: a crack in the wall, a hole in the floor, a rotted beam waiting to give way. He had no electricity yet, no running water. The old well pump beside the house groaned when he tried it, coughing up only mud. In the evenings, his muscles burned, his palms were raw, and his clothes clung to his skin with dust and sweat. But every time he looked at Lily, playing in the weeds with her stuffed rabbit, something inside him hardened into determination. He could not fail here. Not now. They made small progress. One weekend, he found an old generator in the shed behind the barn. It was rusted, but after hours of cleaning and a few lucky turns, it sputtered to life with a choking roar. The single bare light bulb hanging from the kitchen ceiling flickered on for the first time in years. Lily gasped and clapped her hands. "We did it!" she shouted. Thomas laughed and lifted her up, spinning her once before setting her down again. For a brief moment, the ruin around them didn't matter. The light felt like a promise. Still, nights were hard. The wind whispered through the cracks of the walls, and the barn groaned as if alive. Coyotes howled in the distance, and once Thomas woke to find the front door swinging open, he stood there with the flashlight, heart pounding, staring into the dark yard. Nothing moved except the tall grass swaying in the wind. After that, he wedged a heavy board against the door every night. He didn't tell Lily about it. She needed her dreams untouched. In town, the locals had already started talking. When he went to buy nails and feet at the hardware store, he heard the whispers. "He bought the McKinley place," one woman said. "That old wreck? Poor fool." Another man chuckled. "That land's cursed. Everyone who's tried to fix it gives up." Thomas pretended not to hear, paid for his things, and left. Outside, as he loaded the truck, the store owner came over and leaned on the window. "You're wasting your time, son," he said, not unkindly. "Some places don't want to be lived in." Thomas met his gaze. Maybe they just need someone who won't leave. Back at the ranch, the days passed in a rhythm of labor. He repaired the porch, cut down the weeds that strangled the front yard, and dug trenches to redirect rainwater away from the house. His hands cracked and bled, and his shoulders ached constantly. But with each board replaced, each inch of ground cleared, the place began to change. The land no longer looked abandoned. The first evening, they managed to cook a real meal. Potatoes and beans heated on the restored stove. Thomas sat on the steps watching the sun sink behind the hills. Lily climbed beside him, resting her head on his arm. "It's starting to look like home," she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. Sometimes in the quiet after sunset, he thought of Anna. She would have loved this place. The smell of grass after rain, the open sky filled with stars. He could almost hear her laughter in the wind, teasing him for taking on more than he could handle. But her absence was like a shadow that never left, and every time he looked at Lily, the ache deepened. He promised himself he would make this life worth the pain. One afternoon, while clearing out the barn, he noticed how strange it felt inside. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, turning the air to gold dust. The smell of hay and rust was thick. He found old farm tools scattered across the floor, a broken wheelbarrow, a pile of weathered boards stacked in a corner. The walls were lined with cobwebs and the floor creaked with every step. But what caught his attention was the far corner, a section where the boards didn't match the rest. They were darker, thicker, laid unevenly as though someone had replaced them long ago. When he stepped on them, the sound was different, hollow. He crouched and ran his hand along the edge, feeling a faint gap between the planks. He stood there for a long time, heart beating faster. It could have been nothing, just the uneven settling of old wood. Still, he felt an odd pull, a sense that something waited beneath. He looked around, found a crowbar among the scattered tools, and pried gently at one of the boards. It didn't move. He tried again, harder. The board lifted slightly, revealing a flash of metal beneath. Thomas froze. It looked like the edge of a steel hinge. He replaced the plank quickly and sat back, breathing hard. The barn felt different now, the air heavier somehow. He could hear the faint creak of wood shifting, the hum of the wind outside pressing against the walls. For a moment he imagined someone long ago standing exactly where he stood, hammering those boards into place, sealing away whatever lay below. He shook his head, telling himself he was being foolish. It was probably just an old drain or storage pit. Still, when he walked back to the house, the thought stayed with him, clinging like dust to his skin. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she asked, "Do you think we'll stay here forever?" He hesitated. "I hope so," he said finally. "If we can make it work." She smiled sleepily. "Then we will." She turned over, clutching her stuffed rabbit. He watched her for a moment before returning to the front porch. The moon hung low over the hills, lighting the barn in a silver outline. From this distance it looked peaceful, innocent even, but Thomas couldn't forget the hollow sound of those boards or the glint of metal beneath them. He stayed there long after midnight, the night air cool against his skin, listening to the wind move through the grass. The land was quiet again, but not silent. It breathed. It waited. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Thomas finished his coffee, set the empty mug beside him, and whispered into the dark, as if to the ranch itself. "Whatever secrets you've got buried here, I'll find them. But you're mine now. We're staying." In the distance, a faint creak drifted from the direction of the barn, one of the loose doors shifting in the breeze, or perhaps something else. He listened for a moment longer, then stood and went inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the field under the moonlight, the barn still and watchful in the dark. The discovery he had made that afternoon might have seemed small, but it was the first whisper of the past calling to him, and before long, it would no longer let him rest. The morning after Thomas noticed the strange hollow sound in the barn floor, he tried to convince himself it had been nothing more than tiredness playing tricks on him. He had worked too long the previous day, his back ached, and his eyes had burned from the dust. But as soon as he stepped outside, the barn seemed to draw him in, standing silent and patient in the thin light of dawn. The boards on the wall gleamed faintly with dew. He told himself he only wanted to finish cleaning, yet his boots carried him directly to that same corner as if the place had been waiting for him. The air inside was cool and heavy, with the scent of old hay and rust. Dust drifted lazily through shafts of sunlight, slicing between broken roof panels. Thomas ran his hand along the rough wooden wall, then crouched where the mismatched boards lay. The faint line between the planks was still visible, a hair-thin seam that looked deliberate. He hesitated only a moment before prying at the edge with his crowbar. The first board resisted, then gave way with a groan, releasing a breath of cold air from below. Beneath it was another layer of wood, denser, darker, and reinforced with iron edges. When he brushed away the dirt, he saw the faint outline of a rectangular lid, and in the center, a corroded steel latch. His heart began to beat faster. He knelt, running his fingers along the metal. It was not just a loose board or a storage compartment, it was a sealed hatch. He found the handle, but when he pulled, it did not move. A lock, thick and ancient, secured it in place. For a long moment he just knelt there in silence, staring at it, the weight of years pressing down from every side. Then he sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly. Whatever lay beneath had been meant to stay hidden. He didn't tell Lily that morning. When she asked why he looked so distracted, he smiled and said he was thinking about the next repairs they needed. She accepted the answer easily. For her, the barn was just another part of their home, not a mystery. But for Thomas, The image of the metal handle beneath the boards haunted him all day. Even at work, hammering and lifting on the construction site, he found his mind drifting back to it. What could be down there? Tools, perhaps, or supplies from the last owner. Or something worse, some forgotten remnant from a darker time. By the time he returned to the ranch that evening, the sky was bruised purple with sunset. He grabbed his lantern and a wrench from the truck, determined to see what lay beneath that floor. The barn loomed tall and hollow in the twilight, its wooden ribs glowing gold in the fading light. He stepped inside, the sound of his boots echoing. The lock was thick, its surface eaten by rust. He tapped it with the wrench, flakes of orange iron falling away. He struck harder, again and again, until his arms ached. Finally, the metal snapped with a dull crack, the chain slipping loose. For a moment, he hesitated. The silence in the barn deepened, as if the whole place were holding its breath. Then he gripped the iron handle and pulled. The lid lifted slowly, groaning like a living thing. A rush of air swept up from below, damp and cold, smelling of earth and time. He raised his lantern and aimed it downward. Stone steps descended into darkness. At first he could only stare. It wasn't a simple storage pit. The stairs were narrow, carved from solid rock, worn smooth by age. Moss clung to the walls. The darkness seemed endless. He swallowed hard, then looped the lantern's handle over his wrist and began to descend. The air grew colder with every step. Water dripped somewhere, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. His breathing sounded too loud, the creak of his boots almost intrusive. When he reached the bottom, the space opened into a small underground chamber. The walls were lined with stone, the ceiling arched low enough that he had to crouch. The lantern's glow revealed shelves along the walls, some collapsed, others still standing, laden with the ghosts of what they once held. Wooden crates sat stacked in corners, their lids warped and blackened. He brushed away the dust from one and pried it open. Inside were old tools, wrenches, gears, bolts, everything rusted but meticulously arranged. As he explored further, he found more objects half buried in the dirt. A helmet, its surface dented and dull. Fragments of rifles, their wood long rotted away, the steel mottled with corrosion. A faint unease prickled his skin. These were not farming tools. They were relics of war. He crouched and ran his hand over the ground, feeling something smooth and rectangular buried beneath the dirt. When he dug it out, he discovered a tin box sealed with wax. He peeled away the residue and opened it. Inside were yellowed envelopes, stamped and dated letters, some bearing military markings, others from factories and dealerships. He couldn't make out all the words, but one thing was clear. They were old, decades old. He moved the lantern closer to the far wall and found something even stranger, a large iron engine, or what was left of one, its pieces scattered across the ground like bones. Nearby lay the skeletal frame of what could only have been a motorcycle, rusted nearly beyond recognition. There were several of them, each in pieces, carefully arranged as if someone had been working to restore them. The place was not just a cellar, it was a workshop, a secret one. In one corner, half buried under fallen stones, Thomas noticed a chest. Its wood was swollen with moisture, but the hinges were still intact. He pried it open carefully, and inside, among the fragments of cloth and rusted nails, he found a small leather-bound book. He lifted it gently, brushing away the dirt. The cover was cracked, the pages warped, but the ink was still visible. On the first page, written in an elegant hand, was a name, George McKinley. The date beneath it read 1932. The name froze him. McKinley, the same name carved into the barn sign, the same name that had echoed in whispers from the townsfolk when they warned him not to buy the place. He turned the page. The writing was tight, deliberate. The first entries spoke of the farm's struggles during the Great Depression, failed harvests, debts piling up, neighbors losing their land. But as he read on, the tone changed. The writer described trips to auctions, collecting machines of progress that others abandoned, motorcycles, engines, even military equipment. He wrote of preservation, of saving what the world was too foolish to value. Thomas flipped through more pages. The entries grew darker, more paranoid. McKinley wrote about men watching the ranch at night, of neighbors asking questions, of hiding his collection where no one could find it. "They call me mad," one line read, "but someday they'll understand. The future will need these things and I will have kept them safe." Thomas set the book down, his hands trembling slightly. He felt both awe and unease. The cellar was more than a hiding place for machines. It was a vault of obsession. McKinley had built this space to protect his legacy, but it had become a tomb instead. He stayed there for a long time, reading by lantern light, until the air grew too heavy and the sound of dripping water began to echo in his skull. When he finally climbed back up, the daylight spilling through the barn door seemed almost too bright. He stood there, breathing hard, the leather book clutched to his chest. That evening, he laid the diary on the kitchen table. Lily was drawing by the window, humming softly to herself. He watched her for a moment, then looked back at the diary. It felt wrong to tell her everything, at least yet. The past that slept beneath their feet was strange and heavy, and part of him feared what more he might uncover. Still, he couldn't ignore it. He had found something that connected him to this land in ways he didn't yet understand. As night settled over the valley, Thomas sat alone by the window, turning the diary's pages. The writing shifted again near the end, growing frantic. McKinley had written about losing everything, the bank, the town, even his family. The final entry ended abruptly with the words, "If my blood still walks this land, let them find what I could not finish." Thomas read those lines again and again until the words blurred. "My blood," he whispered. It echoed in his mind. The old clerk at the courthouse had said the ranch had belonged to the McKinleys for generations. Could it be possible? He thought of his mother's maiden name, a name she never spoke much about, Emma McKinley. He felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be coincidence. The lantern light flickered, casting shadows across the walls. Thomas closed the diary and placed it gently on the table. The air in the house felt charged, as if the past had awakened and was now breathing beside him. Outside, the barn stood under the moonlight, its dark shape quiet and watchful. He realized that what he had found beneath it wasn't just history, it was inheritance. And whatever legacy the McKinleys had buried in that earth had now passed to him. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, watching the fields until dawn, the diary open in front of him. The words inside no longer felt like they belonged to another man. They felt like a summons. The land had chosen him, and he could feel it watching, waiting for him to uncover the rest of its story. The days that followed his discovery of the diary passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Thomas moved through his work as if in a trance, his mind divided between the present and the world that had been sealed beneath his barn for nearly a century. The cellar, the relics, the rusting motorcycles, and the diary. They had all become an obsession that refused to leave him. He had taken the book to bed, read it at breakfast, and carried it in the truck on his way to work. The more he studied it, the clearer it became that what he had found was more than a curiosity. The documents, letters, and transactions described within were a hidden record of the McKinley family's ownership of this land, and perhaps the proof that they had been wrongfully stripped of it. Each night, when he looked at the weathered beams of the house or the overgrown fields that stretched toward the horizon, he felt something deeper than pride, something ancestral, like the faint echo of memory calling from the soil itself. The surname McKinley still looked strange beside his own on the old documents, but it no longer felt foreign. He remembered his mother's silence about her family, the way she avoided questions about where she had grown up, how she had once said that some stories aren't worth the pain they bring. Now Thomas wondered if she had known more than she had ever let on. He could not let the matter rest. One afternoon he took the diary and several of the sealed envelopes he had found below to the county archive. The building was quiet, its walls lined with filing cabinets and the dry smell of old paper. Behind the counter sat a woman with silver hair and half-moon glasses, her expression patient but wary as he unfolded the fragile documents on her desk. "I found these in the house I bought," he said, trying to sound casual. "They belong to the McKinley family. I was wondering if you could tell me if they're real." She studied the pages carefully, adjusting her glasses. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone who had spent her life handling history. After several minutes, she looked up. "Where did you say you found them?" Her tone had changed slightly, cautious. Thomas explained briefly about the barn, the cellar, the sealed chest. She listened without interrupting, though her brows furrowed in disbelief. When he finished, she sat back inside. "These are authentic," she said. "The stamps, the ink, the paper, they match the 1930s. But this," she tapped the diary, "this is extraordinary. You realize what you have here, don't you?" Thomas shook his head. "Just an old family's papers." She smiled faintly. "More than that, these could prove a chain of ownership. If these documents were never transferred or nullified, part of that land might still legally belong to the McKinley heirs." The words settled over him like thunder. Legally belong. It took a moment to sink in. He thanked her, packed the documents carefully, and left the building, his heart pounding. Outside, the sun was blinding, and for a few seconds he stood on the steps breathing hard, the world spinning around him. He had thought the ranch was just a refuge, a last chance to build something for his daughter. Now it might be something much greater, a birthright stolen generations ago. When he told Lily, she was sitting at the table drawing a picture of the barn. Her eyes widened when he explained. "You mean it was ours all along?" she asked. He hesitated, smiling gently. "Maybe not ours, but our family's once. Maybe we were meant to come back." She nodded solemnly, as if that made perfect sense, then went back to coloring, humming softly. But good news never traveled far in a small town without changing shape. Within a week, strangers began appearing near the property. A pickup truck idled too long at the end of the road one evening. Two men came to the door another day, claiming to be from a development company that owned the adjacent land. They smiled too broadly, their suits too clean for the dusty valley. They told him they had heard he'd found some interesting old documents and offered to help him manage them. Thomas declined. The smiles froze on their faces. "You might find it's better to cooperate, Mr. Miller," one of them said before they drove off. That night, the fence near the barn was cut. He repaired it silently, his anger burning low and cold. The following week, he returned to the archive, carrying more of the papers he had unearthed. The clerk helped him trace the property records. They discovered that sometime during the late 1930s, the McKinley Ranch had been absorbed by a local trust, which years later was bought by a corporation now controlling nearly half the valley's farmland. The signature authorizing the sale didn't match the name of any McKinley still alive at the time. Forgery, perhaps, or fraud. Either way, the truth was buried deep. When he left the archive that day, he already knew what he had to do. He would file a claim, not for money but for justice, to correct the record and reclaim the legacy his family had lost. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about everything it stood for: dignity, memory, belonging. But the opposition came fast. Letters arrived from lawyers, written in polished language that dripped with condescension. They accused him of trespassing, of tampering with property, of fabricating historical claims. At night, headlights appeared on the ridge above the ranch and lingered. The phone rang with silence on the other end. Lily began to wake from bad dreams, saying she heard footsteps outside. Thomas started sleeping with a hammer by the door. He tried to act calm for her sake, though exhaustion gnawed at him. Some nights when the wind pressed against the house, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake stirring up the past. Then one morning, a letter came from the county courthouse. His claim had been accepted for review. A hearing was scheduled. He sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper while Lily watched him, sensing the importance of it even if she didn't understand. "Is that good?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "It means they'll listen." The day of the hearing was gray and cold. The courthouse steps glistened from a recent rain, and the townspeople had gathered out of curiosity. Inside, the room smelled of dust and paper. On one side sat Thomas and the elderly archivist who had agreed to testify. On the other, 3 lawyers in dark suits, their faces unreadable. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Thomas felt Lily's hand slip into his, small, steady, certain. The hearing stretched for hours. The corporation's lawyers mocked him, calling his evidence romantic fantasy, accusing him of planting the documents. But the archivist's calm voice cut through their arguments. She presented the papers, the ink analysis, the genealogical record showing Thomas's link to Emma McKinley. The courtroom grew quiet. Even the lawyer's confident smiles began to fade. Finally, the judge spoke, his tone measured but grave. The evidence appears authentic. The deeds were never legally transferred. This land by right belongs to the heirs of George McKinley. The words struck like lightning. Thomas closed his eyes, gripping Lily's hand tightly. For a moment he couldn't breathe. When he opened them again, the room seemed brighter, larger. He heard murmurs, the shuffling of feet, and someone saying softly, "Well, I'll be damned." Outside, the sky had cleared, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Reporters from the local paper approached, but Thomas waved them off. He had no interest in becoming a spectacle. All he wanted was to go home, to his home. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Lily looked up at him. "Does that mean it's really ours now?" she asked. He smiled, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, baby, it's really ours." They drove back to the ranch in silence, the road stretching wide before them. When they arrived, the sun was sinking behind the hills, turning the fields gold. Thomas stood by the truck for a long moment, staring at the barn. It no longer looked broken to him. The cracks and weathered boards seemed like scars, proof of endurance. He felt something settle deep inside, a peace he hadn't known in years. But as night fell and the first stars appeared, he knew the struggle wasn't entirely over. The company wouldn't give up so easily, and the weight of what he'd uncovered was more than one man should have to bear. Still, he had won the right to stay, to build, to protect what his family had begun generations before. For the first time since buying the place, he didn't feel like an intruder. The land recognized him now. That evening, as the lamps flickered in the windows and the wind moved softly through the grass, Thomas stood in the doorway, watching Lily chase fireflies in the yard. Her laughter carried across the darkening field, bright and free. He felt the world shift within him, the past and present entwining, the soil beneath his feet finally at peace. The ranch that everyone had laughed at, the ruin no one wanted, had given him back not just land, but identity. It had taken nearly a century, but the McKinley name had found its way home again. And as the moon rose above the hills, bathing the barn in silver light, Thomas whispered a silent promise to those who came before. The fight was over, and the legacy would endure. When the storm of court hearings and newspaper whispers finally subsided, the valley seemed to exhale with him. For the first time since he had driven that old truck up the dirt road months ago, Thomas felt as though he could breathe without the tightness of fear pressing against his ribs. The papers were signed, the decision final. The land, the barn, and the surrounding acres were now his, recognized by the county as belonging to the last living branch of the McKinley family. He carried the stamped deed folded neatly inside his jacket, like something sacred, afraid that if he left it anywhere else, the world might find a way to take it back. The morning after the ruling, he and Lily drove out to the ranch before sunrise. The road shimmered faintly with dew, and mist hung low over the fields, turning everything silver and dreamlike. When they reached the gate, he stopped the truck and let the engine idle. The barn stood ahead, half in shadow, half in light, its roof still bowed from years of neglect. But it no longer looked like a ruin to him. It looked like a promise waiting to be kept. Lily climbed out first, barefoot, her hair tangled from sleep. She ran ahead into the tall grass, laughing, and for a moment, Thomas simply watched her, that small, bright spark moving through the fog, like a living piece of the future. He spent the following weeks repairing everything he could with his own hands. The work was exhausting, but it carried a rhythm that soothed him. He patched holes in the roof, replaced broken beams, and sanded down the door until it closed smooth and tight. Old friends from the construction site stopped by to help on weekends, curious at first but soon caught up in his determination. They brought lumber, paint, nails, and beer. One of them, a wiry man named Dennis, who had once laughed hardest at Thomas's crazy purchase, stood in the doorway one evening, shaking his head. "You really did it, didn't you?" he said quietly. Thomas smiled without looking up from his work. "Not yet," he replied, "but I will." Each day ended the same way, with the smell of sawdust and sweat, the scrape of a trowel, the hum of crickets when the sun dropped behind the hills. At night, after washing in the cold water from the well, he would sit outside and look at the silhouette of the barn against the stars. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the land had accepted them. Lily would curl up beside him with a blanket, pointing out constellations. She had learned the names of the stars from a library book: Orion, Cassiopeia, Pegasus. "It feels like Mama's watching from up there," she would say softly, and he would nod, unable to find words. By midsummer, the barn stood whole again. The walls were freshly painted, the roof strong enough to face another 100 years of storms. Thomas hung a small wooden sign above the door, carved with care from an old plank he had salvaged from the wreckage. The letters were simple but proud: McKinley Ranch, reborn. When he stepped back to look at it, something inside him eased, as though a circle long broken had finally closed. It was Lily's idea to turn part of the barn into a place for others to see what they had found. "It shouldn't stay hidden anymore," she said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. "Grandpa George, the one who wrote the diary, he wanted to save things so people would remember. Maybe we can do that now." Thomas smiled at the way she said Grandpa George, as if she had known the man personally. He realized then that she was right. The relics he had uncovered in the cellar below were pieces of a story too large to belong to them alone. So he began to clean and restore what he could. The motorcycles, the tools, the faded photographs. Each item found a place along the barn walls. The diary, protected in a glass case, sat at the center. Neighbors who once mocked the idea of restoring the ranch began to stop by, curious to see the collection. They walked through the barn slowly, their voices hushed, as though entering a church. Many of them had ancestors who had worked these lands or fought in the same wars as George McKinley. For some, the visit brought back their own forgotten memories. For others, it was the first time they saw history not as something distant, but as something alive beneath their feet. Word spread quietly. A local historian offered to help Thomas document the items properly. A group of school teachers asked if they could bring children for field trips. Even the mayor visited one afternoon, shaking Thomas's hand and calling the barn a piece of the county's soul. Thomas only smiled politely, though inside he felt no vanity, only gratitude. He had not set out to build a museum, but perhaps this was what the ranch had always been meant to become, a place where memory could live and breathe again. The change rippled outward. Farmers from nearby towns began returning to abandoned plots of their own, inspired by what Thomas had done. A cooperative formed, and slowly, the valley that had once been dismissed as dying land began to stir back to life. The ranch became a gathering place for meetings, markets, and celebrations. During the harvest, families came with baskets of corn and apples, trading goods and stories. The laughter of children echoed across the fields, mixing with the steady hum of cicadas. One evening, as the sun burned low across the horizon, Thomas stood outside the barn watching the crowd disperse after a small fair. Tables had been set up along the fence line, music played from a radio, and children had raced through the fields until the stars came out. Lily was among them, her hair glowing gold in the twilight. When she ran up to him, breathless, she said, "Everyone says you saved this place." He looked down at her and shook his head. "No, sweetheart, this place saved us." When the last of the visitors left and silence returned, he walked through the barn alone. The smell of oil and wood filled the air. The lantern light flickered across the old machines and photographs. He stopped at the diary and rested his hand on the glass. "We did it," he murmured, not sure if he was speaking to George McKinley, to Anna, or to the land itself. Outside, the wind rose gently, passing through the grass like a whisper. Weeks later, when autumn came and the air turned crisp, he stood at the edge of the property looking out over the fields. The morning light caught the roofs of the nearby farms, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys. The ranch was alive again. The laughter of his daughter drifted from the barn where she played with the neighbors' children. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and thought of everything that had brought them here. The poverty, the doubt, the long nights of work and fear. Every hardship had been a step toward this moment. That night he sat on the porch while Lily slept inside. The stars were bright, scattered like dust across the dark sky. He could hear the faint rustle of animals in the fields, the gentle creak of the barn doors shifting in the breeze. In that quiet, he understood something he hadn't before. The land wasn't just soil and fences. It was a living thread that connected every hand that had worked it, every generation that had loved it, every dream that had been buried and then found again. It was legacy, not as wealth or property, but as memory, enduring, patient, and eternal. He leaned back, letting the wooden chair creak beneath him, and watched the moon rise over the hills. The barn's roof glowed faintly in the silver light. Somewhere beneath it, the cellar still waited, its walls lined with the past. But above, the sound of life went on. Laughter, footsteps, the faint melody of hope carried on the wind. Thomas smiled, a quiet, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. For the first time in his life, he was not running from anything, not chasing what he couldn't reach. He was home. The ranch that everyone had laughed at had given him more than a roof or a living. It had given him back a name, a purpose, and a peace that no storm could ever take. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the valley once more, Thomas whispered softly to the sleeping land around him, "We're here now. We're home for good." If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are even more unbelievable true stories coming your way. Watch the next video right here. Each one will make you see life in a whole new light. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and them feel the same chills you just did.